Hi, and welcome to our lecture for this unit where we're learning all about ethics and advocacy. So today, this lecture actually is going to focus more on advocacy and specifically talking about special education advocates because there's been a lot of attention in the news and probably a lot of your professional careers with special education advocates. So we're going to talk a little bit about a study that I conducted, and hopefully it'll provide you with some good information. So I just want to acknowledge that it's kind of with the old times that we only look at due process mediation and state complaint as ways to resolve conflicts between families and educators. And we do know that throughout due process mediation and state complaint procedures, families always have the option of utilizing an advocate to support them through the process, a lawyer or a special education advocate. Now, we do have a big influx of special education advocates that have kind of grown over the last decade, I would say, in the field of special education, particularly in the area of dispute resolution. So I wanted to bring this up, although I do say that, alternative dispute resolution, a lot of other, as you know, my research is clearly very biased in that I think there's more than we can do than due process and mediation and state complaints. That being said, those procedures are there for a reason, and families always have the option of looking toward an advocate. So I'm going to talk to you about the role of an advocate or adversary, and talk to you specifically about an advocate as an adversary or an ally. Not to say an advocate is an adversary. So the reason why I'm presenting this research and why this started was based on my research and looking at families and professionals that do experience conflict. One thing that I've heard a lot of, and I've experienced myself as a special educator, are some of these advocates that are sometimes more harmful to the team than helpful. And so a couple of years ago, I decided that there needed to be more research about this. Now, a good colleague and friend of mine, Megan Burke, does a great deal of research on advocates and specifically looking at trainings for advocates, and coming from that ally advocate role, where basically, the word advocate in itself, let's think about what it means and how somehow over the years what's happened is it started out that advocating was a good thing, and it was standing up for what's right, what's necessary, and it's because of advocates, and that means students who are advocating for themselves, as well as families who advocate for their students, as well as community members or just friends or family that are also standing in as advocates for individuals with disabilities. Well, those advocates made change happen, and we're very appreciative of them. It's because of the advocacy efforts that we have IDEA, that Public Law 94-142 came about. As you know from reading a lot of the reading throughout the semester, looking at Joe Shapiro's book, we know that advocacy is necessary for good change to happen. Unfortunately, somehow over the last 10 years, the role of advocate, which used to be really favorable and pleasant to hear and helpful to families, has become replaced with sort of cringes and, like when educators say an advocate's coming to a meeting, everyone's like, oh, better bring out the guns and be ready to handle this situation with their challenging language. And it's very sad, and it makes me sad because I know that advocates are there to support families, and many of them are family members. And so I wanted to do a study and really look at what is the role of an advocate during situations of conflict, and what is a helpful versus unhelpful advocate. What does that look like? And out of that research came the words adversary and ally. Now, I knew going in, we know qualitatively we always have that researcher's stance, and that researcher bias. And I knew going in that there was likely going to be this divide between an adversary and an ally. I just didn't realize it would be so clear. So while much of the study that I'm going to present to you is not going to be shocking to you, you're going to be like, well, of course. At the same time, nothing's published about this, specifically to conflict. And so if we don't publish it, we can't say it exists. Even though it's sad to say, but our experiences, our craft knowledge, if there's no research to support it, then technically we really can't be saying it in research papers unless we have the research data to support it. So this is a study that's intended to support this information. So you might have seen this before. It's one of my favorites to show. It's the, I'm not sure why Mr. Barth always feels compelled to bring an advocate to the IEP meeting, because if you'll look, there's this is so common, right? the parent shows up, and then there's like 20 professionals standing there across the table from them talking at them rather than talking with them. So this is why families started to really bring advocates to the meeting and also to their lives, is because we've got research that shows that when families work with advocates, it helps them understand the system, understand their rights and responsibilities, know how to support their student, etc. So one thing that is worthy of kind of just talking about right off the bat is that attorney presence at IEP meetings and mediations is not a new concern. We've had this going on for years. We know that attorney practice tends to disrupt what's intended by IDEA as that working collaborative relationship between families and professionals. So that's not a shocker, because we know attorney practice tends to be more adversarial. I mean, that tends to be what they're mostly trained to do. That being said, advocates never really were in our research much about conflict and their role with litigation, but now we've gotten more and more anecdotal stories, as well as some research that's showing that special advocates have been involved in litigation as well as IEP meetings that have actually increased some of that challenging behaviors that we see with attorneys. And that's kind of what I was, just alluding to a little bit ago. So for the purpose of clarity with this study, I defined special education advocate as someone who was hired either nonprofit or for money to provide parent support. So not the parent themselves being the advocate, but someone who's external to that parent who's providing those services. So with this study, what I did was I wanted to talk to educators, parents, and advocates about their perceptions and experiences with the role and of special education advocates, particularly during conflict. I did a qualitative interview study. You're probably not surprised. I'm a talker. I like to talk to people, and I find that qualitative research really works well for what I study. So here's a table of the participants. And again, I know my face is blocking some of the text throughout this PowerPoint, but I will certainly make this PowerPoint available to you through PDF so you can look through the whole thing without my face being stuck right in the middle of it. So hopefully you've had a chance to kind of look through this a little bit. 12 advocates were interviewed. They ranged from their years of experience to 1.5 years all the way to 27 years. Asked them about mediation, how many of them had been involved in mediation. Also ranged from 0 to 10 to 15 to 2 to 3 a year to 20. Actually, it should be 0 to 20 is the range. Same with due process. Now, whenever you ask these demographic questions, sometimes people don't know. I mean, they can't recall. Particularly this person who had 10 to 15 mediation just said yes for due process. So we don't know how many. And a lot of them didn't have experience with due process. So the educators, we had 16 educators. And you'll notice a lot of them were administrators. We had a lot of special educators, ranging years experience from 1 to 30 years. Oh, nope, we got a 45-year person there. Good grief. I would kind of want to be out of the field of special ed after 45 years, although I'm getting up there. Kidding. Mediation, 0 to 7, and then due process, 0 to 13. Woo! That person's got 25 years of experience. So you would think that I had read this before, and I have. I just don't usually talk about it out loud. Plus, I try to provide you all entertainment during my lectures, so hopefully you're laughing. Maybe you're laughing. I don't know. And here's the parents. There were 12 or 15 parents, 0 to 1 mediation, and 0 to 1 due process. So, by the way, that's a pretty large qualitative study. So that was not easy to do. Normally, and qualitative research says you need about 12 homogeneous groups to reach saturation. So I reached that with all 3 groups. So for data analysis, I did the typical coding, open, axial, and selective coding. I'm not going to get into the details of that, so hopefully you have an idea of that as a doctoral student. Hopefully you've learned about qualitative research. If you haven't, you can read some articles that talk about it more, but open, axial, and selective. Open, you start with reading all the codes, and you just, line by line code them, and then you categorize them into themes, and then you selectively code and find out which ones are more dominant. Now, I'm an old school coder. It's kind of funny, I'm in my office here, so normally a lot of people like to code online, which I do that as well, but I also like to code old school. So I highlight and I write in the margins, and that's for another study I'm actually doing with 2 colleagues on conflict experiences of families who have children with sensory disabilities. So I have, just to show you how us our qualitative researchers are kind of gluttons for punishment. These are all transcripts that I'm old school coding this week and next week. All right, so let's talk about the themes for this advocate study. I just wanted you all to see that I actually do work. I know you know I do. I'm just having like a party over here by myself in the office. I really hope you guys are finding some humor in these lectures, or who knows. I never watch them afterwards, so hopefully you're enjoying them. So 3 major themes came up. The first one, which was, like I said, something I kind of went into already having an idea of, and it came through very strongly. There were 2 types of advocates, the adversary and the ally. I'm going to talk about each one of those in a moment. Also, not surprisingly, there was a benefit to having an advocate that both the educator and the parent shared, and of course the advocate shared. And so we'll talk about what the benefit is to having an advocate available for resolving conflict. And then third, and I'm really glad this came up in my study, there's a need for advocate training. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to that theme. So let's first talk about the adversary versus the ally. And you can pause this screen or just look while I take a drink of my tea here. We've got the adversary and we've got the ally. The adversary behaviors are those who replace the parent, meaning they talk for the parent rather than with the parent, or they misinterpret or they're inaccurate about the law. That came up with almost every single participant, parent and advocates included, that a lot of the advocates, and this goes into that training aspect, don't know the law, or there's what we call a hyper interpretation of the law, which we see in a lot of schools with educators even, and families, parents, where it's like, oh no, that's illegal, you can't do this. There's this really big interpretation that's a hyper interpretation of the law, when in fact you should know after reading the regs and doing these You Be the Judges for so long that the law is very vague in many ways, and it's subjective to your own interpretation. And so unfortunately, some of that interpretation becomes a hyper interpretation of what is allowed versus what is not allowed, what is illegal versus illegal, etc. The third is unrealistic expectations for the student. So really coming to the table more about what they want rather than what the student needs. And the last is, unfortunately, a strong theme is that some of those adversary advocates tend to bring their own baggage. And as sad as it made me to read this, this was unfortunately described by a lot of people, advocates and families included, as advocates who have kind of fought the fight for their own child years ago or prior to then becoming an advocate for another family. And unfortunately, because they've kind of been burned so much in the past from their own experiences as a parent, that they bring that same baggage with them to the next family. And instead of being there to support that parent and really wanting to work through that conflict, it's more about the fight, and it's more about proving that a district is wrong. And, you know, as sad as it is to read that finding, I wasn't surprised about it. I've experienced it myself, and I would bet money that many of you are nodding your head going, yep, I know exactly what you're talking about, Tracy. So, you know, and the reason why this research is so good is not like my research is so good, but looking at these kinds of contents, this kind of concepts, is because it helps us know that we need to do something about it. So I'm not surprised. If I had been burned a million times over and then another parent asked me to help them, I would naturally be more biased into protecting them from being, you know, hurt as well in the same way that I was. And so I can see how that happens, and I'm sure many of you can from an empathy standpoint. At the same time, it's not okay for that current student that's being considered, because we're not really resolving conflict. And so that adversary doesn't really help anybody. Ally is student focused, collaborative, knowledgeable, meaning they do know the law or they do know their information, and helpful. So very simple. And I'm guessing most of you who've experienced working with advocates or families or experienced conflict in whatever capacity is probably agreeing that these two categories are something that you've experienced in some way or another. So I just want to bring, I love behavior. Behavior is my world. And I want to bring to everyone's attention, the reason why I have this word behaviors here is to talk about how those adversary versus ally behaviors are very easy to judge, to say, oh, well, that adversary is just a horrible person, or they need to get over it, or blah, blah, blah. But I want to go back to that empathy standpoint that I just brought up. People's behavior makes sense if you think about it in terms of their goals, their needs, and their motives. And so I do believe those adversary behaviors, those adversary advocates can be changed and made for the better. In fact, several of the people that I interviewed were former kind of reformed adversaries turned into more ally advocates, which is great to see and hear. And so it's what we can do with that behavior that can make the difference. So these are a few quotes that I'm not going to read them all out loud to you, but what I would recommend you do is just kind of pause right now, pause my talking head, and just read through these quotes, but these are supportive quotes about what the adversary might bring to the table. And the one that my face is covering up says, most of the advocates, I have to say, came in just ready to go to battle. They came in right away. We were wrong and they were right. We wouldn't do this. And always they were ready to go to battle right away. So, it's very interesting, but in my research, a lot of my research, the words battle, fight, guns blaring, like physical, violent descriptions are often utilized when I hear about these situations, which is not good to hear. So anyway, I'll let you read these quotes and then I'll show you the next quotes. And I like to point out, conflict is inevitable. It's going to happen. And I always say that when I do my training. And that's why I think every educator, this is my soapbox, so just hold on with me. Every educator needs to learn how to work with other people, including how to work through conflict, because conflict will happen. It is inevitable. Conflict is just incompatible goals and perceptions from one another. And it's natural to have incompatible goals and perceptions and thoughts and beliefs, etc., from another person. What you do with it is what makes the difference. So combat is optional. Working through it, combat, that's up to you. That's your ball. That's up to you. That's what's the ball in your court kind of thing. But the reality is, if we're not trained in how to properly handle it, we're going to go with what we either witness or we learn from doing ourselves. And sometimes that's fight, sometimes it's flight, and sometimes it's freeze. So we want to take one of those three responses that our brain naturally has and turn it into a actual practice that's collaborative, that can help the team work through conflict. One quote that was on the previous page, which I thought was really interesting, an advocate said, every advocate should read The Art of War. So holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. This is a saying by Buddha, and I love it. So think about that when we talk about that adversary and what's happening. Here's the advocate as an ally quotes. I would also suggest you pause this and read through these on your own. And the one that my face is blocking says, I make it really clear that I'm not here in contention because there's conflict. I'm here to give mom some moral support, and it helps to position that. In other words, they know before the very first 2 minutes of the meeting, they know that I'm not there to pick a fight. I'm going to turn that ringer down. If it's one of you calling me, I'm sorry, I'm not answering it right now. I'm doing a lecture. So anyway, just go through these quotes and read it and see if you can agree to it. That's an annoying ring. The second major area I want to talk about is the fact that advocates can be a form of support for families. And what I really want to emphasize, again, pause this and read through these quotes on your own, but look at what's in bold, that they're there to help the parent understand what they need to know. And the following one says, explain it in plain language, not pain language, plain language. So here's the thing. You should know and have a good idea by now, through the readings and everything we've done up until now in this class, that special education, the field itself, is incredibly overwhelming for families of children with disabilities. It's overwhelming for me, and I have a PhD in it, let alone a teacher, a parent, a child, a student, etc. And the original intent of having an advocate there is that piece of support, that helpful support, that guidance. Not the person that's going to do something for them, but the person who's going to guide them to something. So they know what they need to be doing at the IEP meeting, so they can be prepared. And sometimes, like that comic that I showed at the very beginning, sometimes it's just having someone to sit next to you so you're not totally overwhelmed looking at like 12 other people across the table from you. So this is the benefits that we're talking about. There's an emotional support for parents, someone that's there to help explain the process and the procedures. And then emotional support, someone that knows the parent and the child. And sometimes it's just someone there to listen to the parents, to listen to the parent vent, to listen to the parent cry, to listen to the parent yell, whatever that is, someone to listen to that parent. And then balancing that team composition, helping the family so they feel like it's not one person against a whole team of professionals, which is what a lot of families feel. So this is a really long one, but I really like it. It's a saying, it's a quote from an advocate. So please pause this and then go on to the next slide. The last finding within this study was really a big, powerful one for me to be able to read and identify, and I want to investigate this more. And this is what Megan Burke does a lot with her research on advocate training. And if you want any of Megan's articles, feel free to email me and I'm happy to send them to you. She's an awesome person. But she does a lot of work on even like on the VAP, which is a fast version of an advocate training, because the last thing we want to do is make advocate training harder for parents to have an advocate, right? So there's this tricky slope, or slippery slope, or whatever the heck that saying is. Wow, I didn't cuss. But there's this slope of we want advocates to have information and knowledge that's pertinent and that's accurate, right? But at the same time, we don't want to make it so hard for people to represent themselves as an advocate that parents aren't able to get an advocate there to support them. So it's kind of like this balance between, we know that there's a need to train advocates in the area of law specifically. So I asked them, what information do advocates need to know? Do you think there needs to be a training, etc.? And everybody unanimously said, yes, there needs to be training on the law. Now, it's important to note that in order to become an attorney, you have to have your law degree. So in order to represent a family as an attorney, you have to have a law degree. However, as someone who has a law degree, not me, but I'm saying if someone has a law degree, then there's also a governing board that oversees that lawyer. And so if there is potentially harmful behavior, adversary behavior that's beyond a typical attorney or something unexpected, the Bar Association comes in, right? And they're the governing board. Just like as a BCBA, I have the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. If I do something unethical or something comes up, I have to answer to them. Well, advocates don't have anyone they have to answer to. Advocates also don't have any requirements for training. So what's happening is a lot of people are representing themselves as advocates and charging families ridiculous amounts of money, by the way. And interestingly, in my study, we found that those advocates that charge little to no money tended to be more of the ally, while the adversary ones tended to charge upwards of $300 an hour, which is like, wow. But if you're a parent and you're really kind of being burned, sometimes you get to the point where you're like, I'll do whatever it takes. This is affecting my marriage, affecting my life, etc. So because we've got these people who are representing themselves and charging parents a lot of money, and there's no governing board to say, hey, knock it off. You can't get in the district's face and threaten them like you are, which does happen sometimes. we have to have some kind of governing board or something. And the first thing is training. There has to be training in the area of law. I'll let you pause this and read these quotes. And then I want to talk about the implications for practice here. So if we know that there are adversaries and allies, then we need to address that. So it's important that educators who do partner with advocates are able to prevent or decrease conflict. We know that parents benefit from advocates because they can provide the educational and emotional support. We also know there's a need for advocate training and education for quality control. And so that means, you know, if somebody is, and by the way, advocates technically are not allowed to provide legal guidance because they're not a lawyer. And if you do ever come across an advocate who is providing legal guidance that is not accurate, or even if they are acting as a lawyer, I have been told the Bar Association can be called, and they will, although they're not the governing board for the advocates, they do have enough weight to say to an advocate, knock it off, you're not a lawyer, you can't do that. So this last bullet really needs to be looked into further. We need to find out what is the right amount of training and education that's needed that can still provide families the level of emotional support and availability they need while maintaining the integrity of the role of an advocate who can truly be there to help, ideally, support the student, right? Because that's why we're all here, hopefully. It's to support that student. And if you're an ally, then you tend to keep the focus on the student. But if you're an adversary, it's not about the student. And that's not how it should be. So big picture is we need to re-examine and make room for the role of an advocate. We need to have more literature out there. We need more research like this to really talk about this concept of conflict prevention and resolution, and how does the advocate, where do they, you know, what can we do with this? We need to identify and distribute a set of best practices for advocates to become an ally, almost like a gold standard, right? So, and from the mouths of educators and parents and advocates, this is what's helpful, this is what's harmful. And then, of course, we need to take the time to listen to the underlying needs of families. What is it that families need? And is there a way we can meet their needs, of course, without having to automatically rely on an outside person to come in as an advocate? But I do want everyone to know I very much value the role of the advocate, and the reason why this study was conducted was because I wanted to protect the role of the advocate, because I'm very sad when I hear that people get nervous or upset or roll their eyes when they hear the word advocate, because in 1975 the word advocate had an entirely different meaning than it does now, and it makes me really sad from a parent standpoint, where I know family members truly need and want that support that an advocate can provide. And that is it. I have talked your ear off for almost half an hour. Have fun going through all the resources this week, and we're almost at the end of class. Okay, bye.